Hi everyone. So today we're gonna wrap up the webinars about animation, and I'd like to start where we left off last week with this Lego truck, and I'd like to start by covering a few of the output options and some of the things you have to consider when rendering animations to optimize your quality and render times. So this is the state of the scene as we achieved last week. Uh, I'd also like to point out that just as the week before, this scene is available for anyone to download. We have included links to the resources, the assets to the YouTube recordings. So you can have this scene exactly like I have it here, with all the scene sets with the different animation setups. So let's get started here and let's talk a bit about output. The first thing I want to mention is these timeline settings, because these are going to play a role in how many frames you are going to output and the quality settings. So one thing we notice here is this FPS input box. This is frames per second. By default, it is set to 30. If I click here in the drop-down, we have presets for 12, 15, etc. Frames per second. So you can select any of these presets, and if you select, for instance, 60, then it will render 60. Then your timeline will have increments of basically corresponding to 60 frames for each second. You'll notice also as I click this end button, where I'm taken to the end of my timeline of my animations, that now I'm on frame 961. As I switch this back to 30, you see that I'm now on frame 481. So as you increase the frames per second value, you also increase the amount of frames that you will need to render. So it's you have to be careful not to set this too high, because this will dramatically increase your render time. Basically, if you double the frames per second, you double the amount of frames, and you essentially double the time necessary for the rendering. So I'll leave this at 30 for now. So that's an important consideration, because this setting will also influence the amount of frames in the output options. Another thing that I also showed last week, I'm trying to find a section where the truck is moving at a decent speed. We have this button for motion blur. If we enable motion blur in real time, we get the update with motion blur in KeyShot. This is also the toggle to enable or disable motion blur for offline rendering. So if you want motion blur rendered through KeyShot in your offline animation rendering, in your output, then you need to toggle it right here in the timeline. If you don't want motion blur, you have to make sure that you disable motion blur in real time. Another option here in the timeline is this button for timeline settings. There are a few simple controls here where you can specify the quality for the preview. The preview is this far right button. where if you click it, it basically renders a draft quality of the entire animation. So it does this at a small resolution using the quality settings defined in the settings right here. So I'm gonna stop this for now, but you'll notice that the quality is not as good as you would want for the final rendering, but it's good enough to have at least an idea about the timing of your animations. If I stop this, even if it's not completed, it will still generate the video with the frames that it has rendered so far. You can also save the preview to a movie format, so you can have it available as a draft and can send it around or distribute it for approval, for instance. For now I will discard. So one final option in this timeline settings box is the render end frame option. This is enabled by default, and this means that if I scroll into my timeline, you'll notice as I scroll that I have this gray area right after my current time marker. This, let me zoom in a little bit more, this gray area corresponds with the timing of the frame you are seeing in real time. So what you're seeing in real time basically happens within this time period of this gray area. So with this option for render end frame enabled, if I scrub my timeline, I can now drag the current time all the way to the end of the animation. If I disable this option, I cannot like drag it to the end. By default, you want to have this option enabled, but where this comes in handy, where disabling it comes in handy is if you have, for instance, a turntable. Let me switch to a turntable animation that I made, and I have to switch my camera. Okay, and let me add a turntable to this track. So if I enable render end frame, let me zoom out. Oh, I already had it, so I will delete this one. So the first frame and the last frame will be identical if I render the end frame. But if you want to make a looping turntable, like this, then it doesn't really make sense to render the first and the last frame because they are identical. So if you then disable this option, it will render all frames except for the very last one. So it's just a little more efficient if you're working with looping animations. So you can render it like this, and then you can basically make it loop in, for instance, After Effects, and you will not have this double frame. So that's where that comes in handy. Let's switch back to the presentation scene set. So these are the timeline settings. Just to recap, the frames per second and the motion blur are the most important ones because they will influence the quality and the render time directly. So now if you want to output this animation, we go into render, the render window. So that's this button. And first of all, if you want to render out an animation, you have to be in the animation tab. This tab will be active as long as there are animations in the scene. So just like still images, you can specify the resolution, and furthermore you can specify a time range. By default this is entire duration, and this will render all the frames from the first one until the last one in your timeline. But in this case that doesn't make a lot of sense, because in the beginning of my animation, the first animations basically pull the truck out of the scene, and where I want my animation to start is actually from this point, from frame 31, from the 1 second mark. And that's why I have these handles, these blue handles at the beginning of the end, and they define the work area. So by default this first one starts right at the 0 second mark, and the last one sits at the very end of my animations. If I drag my final animations, there's a crash. Let me start again. Okay. So again, if I drag this final animation, you will notice that as I drag it, it will always follow the end frame, so to speak. So let me drag this back where they belong, like this. So I can leave it like this. I can also drag the final one in, and as you notice, the area behind this work area marker, the end work area marker, will be sort of hatched, so which indicates that these animations are excluded of the work area. I will now drag it back to the end, and also the first one, the start marker, I can also drag this one, and in this case I want to drag it right to the 1 second mark. So now as I then hit this start button, it will set the current time at the start of the work area. If I hit the end button, it will set the current time at the end of the work area. So as I define the work area in the timeline, I can also specify this in the output options. So instead of doing entire duration, which would render 481 frames, I can also select just the work area, and this will render 30 frames less, so it will start from the first second. So this will render 451 frames for a total duration of just over 15 seconds. I can also specify a frame range. So here I can manually input, for instance, the frames to render to be from, for instance, from frame 50 to 400. And one quick tip is that these numbers that you enter here correspond directly with the frame counter you see in real time. So if you specify from frame 50, then basically your rendering is going to start from right where you put the current time marker at frame 50. So you see it highlighted here. This frame counter corresponds directly with these input fields in the render options. Then for output, because we're rendering an animation, you can specify video, which will basically encode a movie after the rendering. So you can specify the name, location, just as you do for stills, and you can also configure the format. We support AVI, MPEG, uncompressed, QuickTime MPEG-4, and Flash video. Besides the video, you can also output the frames as still images. So you can specify the file name, and then one important thing to note is that there is this number generator, which is denoted by %d. This will generate the sequential numbering for the frames. Also notice that if you hover over this input field for name for the frame output, you get a little tooltip which says you can change the %d to, for instance, %04d if you want the frames to have the format. Let me do this again. The format frame.0001. So that's a handy thing to know. And let me just quickly pull up Notepad. So for instance, with the default %d, you will get sequential numbering of 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. until you get to 100. It will just sequentially generate numbers, but maybe sometimes you want your numbering not to be 1 but 001. In that case, what you have to enter instead of the %d is %03d. This will generate the numbering like 001, 002, etc. So that's a quick tip that can be quite helpful if you want to sort of control the way your frames are going to be numbered. So yeah, and you can specify the folders just as well for the video. For the format, you can specify the exact same formats as for still images. I would generally advise to use a PNG, like I advise for still images as well. I would be careful with rendering TIFFs or 32-bit frames, because if you're rendering hundreds of frames, then that's going to take up a lot of disk space. So be careful. I generally stick to using PNG for animations. You can include transparency, which you can use in After Effects, for instance, if you're doing some advanced compositing. You can also render passes. So if you're rendering, if you want to do some masking, you can use the clown pass, which you can use then in turn in After Effects. So there's a lot of flexibility here. Then we have the option section, and here we can specify the quality, and this is the same as for still images, maximum samples, where this is going to be the amount of samples that each frame is going to be rendered for. Then we have advanced control and maximum time, and here is a little difference with still images. You can specify a per frame time or a total duration time. Now, with the per frame setting, every frame is going to be rendered for the exact same time. With the total duration, this is no exact science, but KeyShot is going to try to fit all the rendering within all the rendering of the frames within the time specified. So if you enter 4 hours, then KeyShot will try to complete the rendering in 4 hours. I would generally advise for animations to use the maximum samples setting because this will provide the most consistent quality. The issue with maximum time is that depending on the frame, some frames will be more complex than others, and this scene is a good example of this. So, for instance, at the start of this animation, there is nothing beside a little bit of shadow here. There is not a lot here to render. So this frame is not going to require a lot of computational power. But as this truck comes into view, for instance, this frame is going to be much more complex to render. And as I scroll this all the way to the back, now in the end frame there is a lot of this truck in view, and there's also quite a lot of drastic depth of field, which is typically going to require more samples to render smoothly. And with the maximum sample setting, you're going to be sure that every frame will have the exact same quality. Some frames will be quicker to render, some will take a little longer, but I generally think this is the way to go for best and consistent quality. So I think that covers most of the render option and render output considerations. Then I also want to talk a bit about network rendering. Network rendering is a module, a platform we have for accelerating specifically large jobs, render jobs like animations. So I have the rendering queue here. So network rendering consists of 3 components, which is the master. The master is going to control all the connections, all the network resources. Then there are slaves, which are going to do the actual rendering. And then there is the queue. And the queue is basically the monitor of the network rendering process. And this is the place where you submit jobs. If you are a user, you probably are KeyShot Pro users if you're using animation now with KeyShot 6. You may have noticed we have this queue in the render output window. So here you can add jobs. So if I have set up my animation, I'm happy with my settings, I can add a job. And I can load this list and then process the queue, which will do a local rendering. But if I have network rendering installed, I can also press this Send to Network button, and this will offload this job to the network. And let me go ahead and do this now. So as I send it to network, it will be removed from my queue. If I now go into the queue, I see my job here. And let's talk a little about the options we see here. Now that job has been added, it gets an ID. This is a sequential number of, basically this is the 1019th job I have run on this network rendering setup. And we see that it is rendering. We get a progress bar, and we also see how many frames it is supposed to render and how many it has finished. So we get an update on the status of the rendering, as well as the render time. So we see the elapsed time so far and how much time is still left for the rendering. So this is a nice way of basically offloading your local machine and letting the network do the rendering. For each job we also have a preview panel where we basically get a preview of finished frames. Now, one thing to remember is that you don't, as you're working with the queue, you don't have access to the final frames before the job has finished. I am not running the master service on this machine. I am just using my own machine, which is Dries PC here, as a slave, and I'm running the queue to submit and monitor the jobs. So I don't have access to the frames here, but I can preview the current rendering and I can see how far this job has progressed. At the bottom we see the slave status. I don't have too many slaves connected right now, but there are 4 of them right now. And so you see that my own machine is dedicating 25 cores for network rendering, and then there are 2 with 8 and 1 with 7 cores. So, and also you can see that you can also see the progress for each slave. So you see in a percentage, basically you see how much work the slaves are doing on each frame. With KeyShot 6, the system has been changed and optimized quite a bit for animations, so that now each slave is rendering an entire frame of the animation. So network rendering is really a nice way of offloading jobs to the network and speeding up animation rendering quite a bit. So a rule of thumb is the more cores you throw at an animation job with network rendering, the faster it will render. I'd like to point to our website. So we have a section here about network rendering, how it works, all the modules that you have, all the configuration possibilities, and you can scale it up to 256 cores, even more if you really want to. But this is this can really speed up your performance dramatically. So if I now go back into KeyShot, I can basically unpause my scene and keep working on my scene while the job is basically rendering in the background on the network. And I can always go back and see how my rendering is progressing. Within the network rendering module, we also have the possibility to check or configure our privileges. So you can set the privileges for each user. So there's a full-blown user system where different users can have different privileges. Also, in the slave status, I can set slave schedules. So let me expand this window. By default, this block is all green. But what I can do is for any weekday define when the rendering should happen, and I have presets which I can set to always active or non-work hours. If I select non-work hours, then basically the slaves are going to be unavailable during work hours. This is a handy setting if you are running network rendering in an office setting and you don't want the machines of the employees being used for network rendering during the day. But as soon as the day ends, when the green blocks start, they will be available for network rendering. So this is a good way of controlling network rendering if you're rendering it overnight, for instance. And you can set these schemes for every node individually. So that's a handy feature from a workflow point of view. Also, one thing I want to point out is that this system is completely platform independent. So you'll notice that we have some nodes. All nodes are running different OSs actually. So we have a Windows 7 slave machine, one running Windows 8.1. Then we have a Mac OS X. My MacBook is participating as well, and then we have a Windows 10 machine, and these all work together on the same scene. A nice feature about KeyShot 6 network rendering is that now we also support auto updating for the slaves. So as you update the master machine, the slaves will automatically grab the required update from the master. So that's a nice feature, especially if you don't have permanent access to the slave machines. So you don't have to manually keep the slave machines up to date. I'm going to go ahead and delete this current job because I want to talk a bit about scripting as well, because scripting is going to be very helpful if you're doing animations. Let me just go ahead and open a new scene. So to access scripting, I can enter the scripting console through the ribbon bar. By default, I get my standard scripts. One of them is encode video. If I run the encode video script, it says encode video from separate frames of a specified range. So let me cancel this for now. You remember I can, for animations, don't have an animation. For animations I can render still frames, and even if I didn't render the encoded video, I can still encode a video after the fact using those frames. So let me find an example. So I have frames here of an animation, actually renderings of an animation, a scene that is supplied with KeyShot by default. It's another thing I want to point out now that in this last session, let me go back. So in your KeyShot resource folder, so if I go to my documents, my KeyShot resource folder, in the scenes folder, by default, it comes with this advanced animation.bib scene. And if you want to learn more about advanced animations or all the capabilities with part animations, camera animations, material animations, I would really advise to have a look at this scene, because it will contain a lot of neat concepts that you could use for your own projects. So let me just play this one back. So this is a Rubik's Cube animation scene. This scene has a lot of part animations, has some a good use case for linked animations as well. There is a material animation on this ground plane where the color shifts and the size of these of the pattern basically changes. So let me double click this one. So there's an intricate material graph here as well, but there are color fade animations which are driving the size of the mesh as you see it on the ground plane, and there's another animation that is driving the color of the metallic spots. So this is a nice scene for everyone to have a look at. So let me just scroll this one more slowly. So again, everyone with KeyShot 6 has access to this scene, and it has a lot of useful pre-setups that you could perhaps use in your own projects. For now, I will close this one down, and again, so I have this scene rendered out as frames, all individual frames, and now with the script I can actually turn these frames into an animation. I will just make sure, so my animation starts from frame 34, and the last frame is frame 664. So again, I will run the encode video script, and here I can specify the folder with frames. This is going to be this folder. Then I have to specify the frame file format. So here you have to specify the name of the frame, which in this case is KeyShot 6 demo animation final, like this. You have to be careful that you need this %D suffix as well, because it helps finding the numbering of the frames. And here I can specify the start frame, which in this case was 34, and the end frame is 664. And I can specify a frame per second, so I leave it at 30 frames per second, and let me call this cube.mp4. So this is going to create an mp4 movie. If I now click OK, then it goes through all these frames and it encodes a video file. So here it generates in the same folder a cube.mp4 movie. So now it has created a nice video based on my frames. So even if you didn't render the video through the output settings, you can still generate a video through the scripting. So that's quite neat. And so everyone has that script actually in their KeyShot installation. So as you open the scripting editor, you will have this script available. This is something we ship with KeyShot, with every KeyShot installation, KeyShot Pro installation. So yeah, we have a bunch of other scripts as well, but this one is the encode video is a nice one if you want to generate videos of frames you have rendered before. You can also, if you have an animation in your scene, you can run the render animation passes, which will basically, yeah, do the same thing as the render output here. So next I want to cover some more advanced animations, because so far we've covered animations that have all been configured inside of KeyShot, but KeyShot also has the capability to pull in animations that were configured in other tools. I have a few examples here. So, for instance, we support the import of Creo mechanisms. If you have built an assembly in Creo that has a mechanism, then for those mechanisms you can output FRA files in Creo that will contain the animation information. In this case, I'm going to import this assembly, a Creo assembly. Simply drag it into KeyShot. And in the import options, I can, at the geometry section, I can set my quality, but also I can import animation from .fra file. This is specific to Creo. As I toggle this one, I get this browse dialog, and here I can select my FRA animation file. If I select this one and open it and then import, it will import the assembly. So I'm hitting C to make the background white, and now I have this assembly imported and it is already animated. This is an animation that was built inside of Creo. Just enabled performance mode. So I have done no setup in KeyShot at all. These animations are just imported as transformations. If I select, so you see a bunch of transformations. These are all, these specify the transformations for each part and subassembly. If I select one, I cannot edit any properties except for the timing. But what I can do is, for instance, if I select this part or this entire cylinder, and then, for instance, right click and apply a fade. So I can actually combine imported animations and KeyShot native animations. So I can add fade animations, rotations, translations, all on top of the imported ones. For instance, if I select this little knob here and then for some reason wanted it to translate, so I can hit translate, and let me set this to local axis and set it to 100 millimeters. Now you'll notice that I have basically created an extra animation on top of the imported one. So by combining imported animations and KeyShot native animations, you can create very interesting presentations of your product. So that's an example of Creo mechanisms. One other thing we support through 3ds Max is deformable animations. And let me go to an example. So this is an example output from 3ds Max. We have a plugin for 3ds Max where you can export animations, even deformable animations. What you get through the plugin is a range of a sequence of BIP files, KeyShot BIP files, scene files, together with a script. I have already added this script to KeyShot, and how you go about this is that you basically open the first scene within the sequence, the 00 scene file. So I'm gonna drag this inside KeyShot, gonna open this. So this is basically KeyShot logo with some curves, some hair as curves added. And what I can do now through the script, and I have added this script as pip sequence update. If I run the script, I can set the output image format. I can set the resolution in width and height to render. I can set the quality and set the camera to use. So if I run this script, what it will do is basically go through all those scenes within the sequence. It will re-import the scenes and update the first scene with a new geometry and retain all the materials as they were set up in the first scene. So it goes through all those iterations, and it actually adds them as jobs to the queue. So now you notice that before this hair was all standing up. Now it's all sort of pointing down. And these jobs, if I go into the render settings, these jobs have now been added as jobs to the queue. And again, I can process these jobs locally, or I can multi-select them and send them off to the network. So if I now open the network queue, then you can see that these jobs are being added and being rendered by the slaves. As it's running in the background on the network, I can keep working on this one or work on other scenes. So again, that's the power of network rendering. If these images, these jobs are being rendered as still frames. So after I have these frames collected in a folder, I can then assemble them into a movie using the encode video script. The script is output by the 3ds Max plugin, by the way. So all you have to do in 3ds Max is open the KeyShot plugin and export it as an animation, and then you will have both the BIP sequence together with the script, which contains all the necessary settings already. So you just have to load it into KeyShot, run it, and you will have your frames. So yeah, I think this concludes this webinar about KeyShot settings as well as advanced animations. If there are any questions or anything that I've covered in previous sessions that you want to me to clarify, then I'm happy to answer them.